All right, so we are talking about human rights today, and we will talk about torture next time, clearly related because the right not to be tortured is seen as a key human right. So essentially what we're going to be talking about today is the way in which human rights talk is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, but it's highly contested, how to understand what rights and human rights are, a little bit about the history of human rights talk and the roots within Christian ethical reflection in particular, and then focus in on this example of Vitoria and his reflections on natural rights, which are the kind of precursor to human rights, and then an alternative way of thinking about justifying human rights in an intuitionist framework as opposed to a natural law framework. And so you'll have an opportunity to reflect on that because one of the major controversies is over the justification of human rights. So as we get started here, a little bit more challenging given that we're split in two locations, but I wanted to just get your juices going this morning by asking you to ask yourselves whether you think there is a human right to rest and recreation. Apropos of snow being out there and luring you to do fun things with it, is there a human right to rest and recreation, and why or why not? So, as I suggested, we hear and see talk about human rights everywhere today. It's one of the most pervasive forms of public ethical discourse, and so the Black Lives Matter movement would be just one prominent example of that, a movement that is talking about how Black people in particular are being deprived of basic human rights, a dignity, and a call to action. And we see this human rights talk enshrined in important documents. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, here's Eleanor Roosevelt holding it up because she played a key role in bringing it to fruition. So this notion that nations will come together around the globe and sign on to this declaration of human rights to commit themselves to their realization, and I'll come back to that. So we really do, especially since World War II, since the Holocaust, since a recognition of horrible crimes against humanity, we see human rights talk expanding in response to that. Human rights talk, so that's the language that we see since World War II. Before that, we do have the language of natural rights. So we think of natural rights talk as coming out of most prominently the American Revolution, the French Revolution, right? Lots of talk about natural rights and big political changes, right, in order to try to guarantee those rights. So let's ask ourselves, what is a right and what is a human right? Human rights and natural rights, how do they relate to one another? An important question as well. So a right is a moral or a legal entitlement, right? A moral or legal claim to have something, to be able to act in a certain way, to be protected from certain things. But it's, so if I have a right to walk across the quadrangle, then you do not have the right to interfere with my walking across the quadrangle. So my right is related to duties that you have. You have a duty not to interfere with me. You might also have positive duties. So if I have a right to the paid vacation, then someone has a duty or a responsibility to ensure that I have the paid vacation. So rights and duties hang together in this way. You have entitlements that are related to duties, responsibilities that others have. So if that's a right in general, a human right is a moral right that is being advanced as a legal right. That either there is a law that protects that moral right, or there is a claim that there should be a law that protects that right. And it's protecting something, the thought is that it needs this legal protection because it's of indispensable human importance. It's central to, as Oliver was articulating, central to a good life, central to human flourishing. But seen as something indispensable, right? Not just a fringe, fringe benefit. It's seen as something that is not earned and not achieved. So You don't have to do anything special in order to have a human right. Just be human, and you've got those human rights. You don't have to be a particularly good example of a human being to have these rights. So they're, in that sense, held by nature. So human rights are seen as natural rights in that sense, right? Just held by virtue of being human. And in general, human rights are seen as so important that they're inviolable, and yet it gets complicated because it turns out that some of them can be suspended in certain circumstances, right? So we kind of get back to this question, are they contextual? And in what way are they contextual? In what circumstances? It seems that some can be suspended or forfeited in extreme situations. And that they are claimable on behalf of all people against all people. That's the idea that's sort of enshrined in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all nations should be committing to this, and then all should hold one another responsible for living up to those commitments. So even though human rights talk and its sort of rootedness in natural rights talk, this is an ubiquitous form of ethical discourse in our world. This doesn't mean that rights talk is uncontroversial. In fact, it's extremely controversial. And it's controversial for a number of reasons. So for one thing, we see conflicting rights claims, and there's not social agreement on how they're supposed to be adjudicated. So is there a right to bodily integrity versus a right to life? And how do those conflict when it comes to something like abortion? Question of what it takes. Do you have to be a born human being in order to be a rights holder? Or can an unborn human being also be a holder of human rights? Lack of disagreement about this. Rights of individuals versus collective or communal rights. So say I belong to a community that opposes higher education. Is that infringing on my individual right to an education? Or does somehow the communal right take precedence in some way? Or are there no communal rights and only individual rights? So lots of controversy about that. And then, what about the more than human world? Are there only human rights? Are there other natural rights that aren't human rights? Rights of other animals, for example? Can rights talk expand beyond the human? Also, concern about the proliferation of rights claims. Once you start generating this list of what things should be protected so that human beings can flourish, the list can go on and on and on and on. And as you're creating that long list, what does that mean in terms of the obligations that are being generated on the other side, in terms of obligating, who exactly are you obligating to provide these? Is this something that all states globally are somehow required to do, regardless of their resources, and so on? And then there is concern also connected with something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Is it just a Western construct that is being imposed around the rest of the world? Should we be concerned about that? Is this another form of imperialism, Western imperialism? And then the big claim hovering over all of this is the question of how rights claims are to be defended and grounded and justified. So interestingly, there have been very strong Christian critiques as well as strong Christian defenses of human rights and natural rights talk. At the beginning of his essay, David Little sketches some of the Christian critiques of natural rights that have been put forth. Very influentially, Alistair MacIntyre argues that there are no natural rights. Belief in natural rights is something like believing in witches or believing in unicorns. Now, he's making a bigger claim, not just that there are no natural rights, but there are no self-evident truths. And he thinks that often the appeal to natural rights is an appeal to a kind of intuition. And he thinks an appeal to intuition is not an argument. And that the appeal to natural rights really is something that reinforces the atomistic individualism of modernity. So modernity has tended to move from a form of ethical reflection that is embedded in communities and relationships, and instead to see the individual as over against the world. and issuing various claims that the world then needs to honor. And the worry here is that it's going to be my claims against your claims, endless conflict, endless inability to figure out how, as individuals, we come together in a harmonious community. What McIntyre argues has been lost here is a teleological context for ethical reflection, a sense of what this is all for. What is it? And in fact, what he would like to see is more reflection of the kind that Oliver was pointing to at the beginning, more reflection on what is it that human beings need in order to live well. We need the virtues, not surprisingly, this is Alistair McIntyre, but we also need physical goods. We need kinds of relationships, forms of society. But he thinks that what these are differ from time to time, place to place, community to community. So he's very concerned about this abstract universalism that tries to say, we can now articulate once and for all, these are the natural human rights that exist. No, let's be more modest in our claims here. Let's return to contextual ethical reflection that asks, what is it to flourish as a human being in this time and place, as a member of this community? And he thinks there's something comical about the kinds of claims that are made in something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. People are claimed to have a natural right to all sorts of things that no one is in a position to really provide for them. And he thinks that's going to cheapen our obligations to one another if it seems as though there's these free-floating rights that no one is actually guaranteeing to anyone. So instead, we should not get rid of rights per se, we should get rid of natural rights, human rights. We should return rights claims to the context of particular communities, particular societies, in which it will make sense to say, I have a right within this context, within this community, to specific goods that others actually have specific duties to provide for me. So that is a main form that the Christian critique of human rights has taken. But many Christians are very enthusiastic defenders of human rights talk, and perhaps most significantly, we might think of the Catholic Church since the mid-20th century. And you have to issue the caveat because there have been some really important changes in the attitude of the Catholic Church to human rights talk. So initially, human rights talk was, since the time of the French Revolution, rights talk was associated with anti-clericalism, right? It was associated with this enlightenment that was overthrowing the Catholic Church and its authority in many ways. So there was a great deal of hostility to human rights, and I think that we still are seeing some hints of that in Alistair McIntyre's worries about rights as hyper-individualist, atomizing, so the individual over against everything else, because that is sort of the idea that he sees as coming, that the church saw as coming out of the French Revolution. We are going to articulate these individual rights and throw out the historic forms that human community has taken in our effort to secure them. So in an earlier time, there was plenty of talk about right, like think of the divine right of kings. What is right? Though that's objective right, we could say. That is talk of what ought to be the case, an objective moral order that we ought to honor in our actions. A just order that has been ordained by God, that's in harmony with God's purposes, in harmony with the natural and eternal law. But that's different than subjective rights. So when I talked about the definition of the right initially as an entitlement, sort of take for granted, it's an entitlement that an individual has, right? That is a subjective right. It attaches to an individual. It's a moral or legal entitlement that I have over against others. So this notion of subjective right was seen by the Catholic Church as an innovation that came about in this secularizing time of the French Revolution. Suspicious, clearly anti-clerical, and that's kind of the story that has gotten to be entrenched. And it was therefore quite a revolution when, after World War II, we start to see papal encyclicals and other official documents of the Catholic Church enshrining the idea of human rights. We'll be reading Rerum Novarum from 1891 in a few weeks, and we'll see how this language of individual rights, subjective rights, not divine right, not the objective right, but individual rights, starts to become a very central form of Catholic ethical discourse. So that happens really in this post-Holocaust context of horror at what had been perpetrated within a legally established government, right? The idea that the things that were done in the Holocaust were legal. And so you couldn't simply say legal rights hadn't been honored. You had to go to a different level. So it was in recognition of this need to articulate something that transcends the level of individual states and the rights that they recognize in their citizens, that we see this move to articulate human rights and the Catholic Church's willingness to transform its hostility to human rights and do this kind of about-face and embrace the language of human rights. And the Universal Declaration that was adopted at 1948 at the United Nations General Assembly was drafted by representatives from around the globe, but a very key role was played by a Catholic Thomist thinker, Jacques Maritain. So he was critical in moving the Catholic Church to endorsing human rights talk and also really to generating global momentum toward accepting this. So if we look at the Universal Declaration to try to see, well, what kind of argument is it making? It's very interesting. So it does not really offer a developed argument. It gestures quickly toward human dignity as a kind of a rationale. So whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, blah, blah, blah. So sort of it starts with, we recognize universal human dignity. We recognize human equality. And we think that horrible things have been done against us, right? Barbarous acts have been perpetrated that have violated human equality and human dignity and inalienable rights. And therefore, we are going to proclaim this Declaration of Rights, and this will be a common standard of achievement for all peoples and nations. So there is here an acknowledgement that it is, in some sense, it's a standard of achievement. It's not something that's already been achieved, but it's not seen as something that requires a great deal of argument. Now, why is that? Why would that be the case? Well, the reality is we're talking a global agreement, right? Vastly different cultures, vastly different religious commitments. And this was a pragmatic approach. So there was much more agreement on the horror of the Holocaust than there was on how to defend universal human rights. Right? Kind of a negative argument. We agree this was barbaric, or we agree this was unacceptable, so we're going to commit ourselves to these human rights. Again, vague reference to universal human dignity, but no argument for universal human dignity. How do we know it exists? What's its foundation? So on and so forth. Well, what rights? Many, many, many rights. But and you may or may not be able to read all of this very, very small print here. But what I want to underscore is there were political rights. There were also economic, social, cultural rights. So rights like right to life, liberty, security of person, no slavery, no cruel and inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment. But then we get to things like the right to own property and not to be arbitrarily deprived of your property, a right to work, a right to equal pay for equal work, a right to rest and recreation, a right to a reasonable standard of living, a right to education. So not merely political rights. And if we think back to our discussion of Saidiya Hartman last time and the way in which she was articulating how it was that in this Reconstruction era, the formerly enslaved were declared to have civil rights, right? They were declared to be responsible moral agents, and this backfired. In fact, it backfired, her argument is, it backfired in large part because they were given civil rights, but they were not given any economic rights, right? There was no support for them that would have enabled them, in fact, to actually fulfill these contracts that they were entering into. And so you could see that as not a critique of rights discourse per se, but certainly a critique of a narrowing of rights to mere political rights without an attention to these economic, social, and cultural rights. But that too remains an ongoing debate. Should governments be in the business of securing economic, social, and cultural rights? And if so, which ones? And so we see major movements to secure the right to a living wage, for example, right, in this country. A right to a living wage. So that it's not the case that you can just enter into a contract to make, a pittance per hour, and that's perfectly legal because you freely signed that contract. This is a kind of a new form of sharecropper system that we see in this country, right, where people are working 3 or 4 or 5 jobs, try to keep things going because there is no right to a living wage. All right, so I've indicated there's Christian support for human rights talk. There's Christian critique of human rights talk. Well, one way to try to get a handle on this question of, well, how should Christians relate to this discourse of human rights is to put it in a little bit more of a historical context, going back beyond the French Revolution, because in fact, this discourse has much, much deeper roots. So Christianity does have a notion of the dignity of each individual person that is bound up with the doctrine of creation in the image of God. Now, we also immediately then need to turn around and acknowledge that the ethical, social, political ramifications of acknowledging that dignity of creation in the image of God have taken several thousand years to unfold, right? So it's one thing to say, are created in the image of God, and it's another thing to say, well, what does that mean for how society would have to be arranged? So more proximately, the language of individual rights develops out of the Christian natural law tradition with roots in medieval scholastic legal commentary. And sorry to rush through these slides that I've already talked our way through. Recall that we discussed briefly this example. If a starving person takes bread from somebody who has more than enough, is this theft? And interestingly, right, in the scholastic commentary, this was clearly seen as lawful, right? Lawful for the starving person to take bread from one who has more than enough. Thomas Aquinas says it, but it was a stock example. Like, this was something that every medieval scholastic had to discuss. Like, is it theft? And it's not theft. And specifically, the argument was that the starving person has immunity from guilt and punishment, has a kind of immunity. Now, Aquinas does not put this in terms of a right to the means of survival. It doesn't use the language of the starving person has a right to the bread, but it amounts to the same thing, that there was an entitlement to take the bread that should be legally recognized. That if the starving person who has taken the bread is taken to court, the court should recognize there was an entitlement to take the bread. So that amounts to a subjective right that belongs to the individual, and it belongs to the individual even if the laws that are on the books don't acknowledge it. Therefore, it's a natural right, and a human right, because it's an entitlement that should be legally recognized even if it is not legally recognized. So by the 16th century, we see robust talk of individual rights, subjective rights that are possessed according to natural law. So this language of what the individual has a right to take, to have, whatever, is nested within this broader ethical discourse of the natural law that we've discussed in some detail. Right? It's not just hanging there. It's seen as embedded within this the natural law, which itself stands in relationship to what we are as creatures, in relationship to God's eternal law, right, and ordained to God's ends. So the 16th century discussion of individual rights that are possessed according to natural law could and was used to critique human law. So it's very much a tool that one could use to critique laws that were on the books. So as scholars have come to terms with this, there is an emerging consensus that human rights talk is rooted in Christian ethics. It's not a secularization, right? But it's rooted in Christian ethics as it's rooted in this natural law discourse. And of course, therefore, those who don't accept natural law discourse are going to have to provide a different kind of justification for natural rights than is provided by those who in some way are on board with the natural rights, with the natural law framework. So I wanted to look at a specific example of the way in which this discourse functions as it's just emerging, right? As the robust notion of subjective rights that are rooted in the natural law is actually functioning. And a great example of this is in this Spanish thinker, Francisco de Vitoria. He's one of the figures in the so-called Spanish scholastic, the school of Salamanca, really working at this period in the late 15th, 16th centuries. And they're extending, or Vitoria in particular is extending the thought of Thomas Aquinas, this natural law framework, into the context of humanism, of the Protestant Reformation, and of the Spanish colonial exploits in the New World. So we are probably much more familiar with late 17th and early 18th century discourse about natural rights. Think of John Locke, whose discussion of natural rights is what really fuels the way that it's framed in the American Revolution and all of those documents. But all of this is flowing out of this discourse that's happening in the 16th century. And in the 16th century discourse, we see much more clearly the transition from medieval scholastic natural law reflection to kind of freestanding natural rights discourse that doesn't nest it within natural law. All right, so what are we talking about here? We are looking at the period of just after the conquest of Mexico, 1520 to 22, Peru, 1531, 32, and there's a lot of controversy back in Spain about this activity. And Vitoria delivers lectures in 1539, and he's grappling with the claim of the Spanish crown to dominion. And originally, the claim of the Spanish crown to dominion in the Americas had rested on these bulls of donation of 1493, where the Pope had basically granted to Ferdinand and Isabella that they could have possession of all lands inhabited by non-Christians that they discovered in the Atlantic. But Vitoria said, well, that argument does not work because the Pope does not have temporal authority. So the Pope does not have the authority to grant dominion, possession of these lands. So if there's going to be a legal title on the part of Spain, it's got to be a title that's grounded in natural law, right? So what could be, so he sets out to explore what could be the natural law justification for Spanish dominion. So he's using the language of rights and rights all the time. He always thinks of right and rights as being meaningful only within a legal order, but he thinks that legal order could be a natural legal order. So that's kind of a response to McIntyre's worry that, well, what these freestanding rights that are kind of floating around, and Vitoria says, well, they're not free-floating. They are nested within a legal order. It's just that this is the natural legal order. So the portion of the text that I assigned is addressing the question of whether what he calls the barbarians, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, whether they had true dominion prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. And true dominion over their own lands, which would then bear on this question of what sort of claim the Spaniards could have. And so it was very convenient for others to make the argument that they were natural slaves. Aristotle had discussed this category of natural slaves. Well, so if the indigenous peoples of the Americas are natural slaves, then Spaniards are just sort of doing this thing that's good for them because they actually need to have a master. And so they need to have someone that has dominion over them. And Vitoria says, no, this is completely false. They were true masters in and of themselves. That is, they possessed true dominion, true ownership. They could own property. They could govern themselves. They're not natural slaves. In order to be characterized as natural slaves, they would have to be irrational, not able to govern themselves. And he says there's plenty of evidence that is completely not true. They, even if they are sinners, even if they do various things, and the most dramatic example, which was discussed by Bartolomé de las Casas, was human sacrifice. Even if they engage in various forms of sin, they can still have dominion. And he says, look, we see this in Europe, right? So we can't say that dominion is canceled by sin, nor is dominion canceled by unbelief. And children and those suffering from severe mental illness, he considers that as a possibility. Are they like children? And he says, well, that wouldn't solve the issue either, because children and those suffering from severe mental illness can be injured. And if you're capable of being injured, that means that you have rights. You have a right not to be injured. So inuria, injustice. So injustice is built into the word injury. So regardless of how, if we want to see them as a sinner, unbeliever, as childlike, whatever, they would still have rights. And in fact, his argument is quite robust. They have already established dominion over themselves. And so they are in no need of having someone else come in and provide this. So they have some order in their affairs. They have properly organized cities. They have proper marriages, magistrates, and overlords, laws, industries, and commerce, all of which require the use of reason. So then he goes on to take up the question of whether, nevertheless, the Spanish somehow gained a just title to their territory. And he criticizes a host of would-be justifications, and then he suggests a few potential justifications, while hinting that they don't really hold. And all of these arguments are made in terms of natural rights, right? Rights that hold by virtue of natural law. And he tries to suggest that conquest is just not necessary to obtaining the desired end. So even on a pragmatic ground, he thinks that the Spanish could just trade with these territories, and that would provide the benefit that is being sought. So he's harshly critical of the extant justifications, but he doesn't go out on a limb, and in fact, he provides some rationalizations that over time gained traction. So we can say that he is absolutely complicit in what went on, even though he's very critical of most of the justifications that were out there. He provides a few little loopholes, and those loopholes were latched onto. So, for example, he says there is a natural right to travel as long as you do no harm. So it's fine for the Spaniards to go and travel to the New World. It's also fine for them to trade with the indigenous peoples. right, so you got those two rights, natural rights. He thinks like the barbarians should recognize those natural rights because they should have access to the natural law, so they should know that they exist. And if those rights are denied, the right to travel, the right to engage in trade, then the Spaniards are justified in waging war on the indigenous peoples and justified in capturing territory in the course of this just war. So after doing all this elaborate argument, like in defending the dominion of the indigenous peoples, he then kind of provides this basis on which that dominion could be undermined in the course of a just war that is waged in order to retrieve the natural rights to travel and the natural right to trade. It gets even more complicated because he also argues that not all sins against natural law can be demonstrated to be so by evidence. And so this basic argument that, well, everybody should have access to the natural law, they should know that these natural rights exist, but then he also acknowledges that you can't always make that plain to everyone. So it's murky. It's murky. But what I'm trying to underscore here is the way in which this natural rights talk, nested within natural law, was used in a very concrete way in this particular context, both in order to defend indigenous peoples, and we see, again, Las Casas does that in a more robust way even than Vitoria, and also used in order to try to legitimate what the Spaniards were doing. So in this context, there was seen as a great need to use natural law reflection to do work, because you couldn't just appeal to Spanish law. You couldn't just appeal to whatever the Pope came up with as canon law, right? You needed something else. So natural law was seen as the discourse that you could use. And natural rights, rights attaching to individuals, rights attaching to particular groups, were absolutely used very, very centrally in this. So we could come out and say, well, okay, so natural rights talk embedded in natural law, and you can have a robust conversation here, but it's being used, it's a double-edged sword, right? It's being used to try to establish the rights of the Spaniards against the indigenous peoples, being used in a contrary way to, on both sides of the question. So does it help at all? Does it accomplish anything? And to some extent, I'll leave you to wrestle with that question. But I think what one could say is they were able to carry on very detailed arguments. There were debates. People voted on who won the debate. Now, whether or not the Spanish crown then felt that they had to acknowledge, like, oh, I guess this guy won the debate and I'm going to therefore have to change my policies, that was another matter. But it wasn't just conflicting claims. It wasn't just disagreement. It was disagreement that had a framework within which it could proceed. All right, so briefly, I actually don't have a clock here, but I think that clock is actually right, so we just have a couple minutes. So briefly, there is a very different way of talking about justification for human rights that does not make an appeal to natural law. And it is probably more common in the contemporary world. And we see David Little in the article for today articulating a fairly well articulated, sorry, double articulation there, defending it in a very, very well thought through way. I think in terms of public discourse, often it's nothing more than, I think we have this right, and that's it. So he thinks that human rights discourse is a deeply embedded common vocabulary in the world today. It just has become a kind of lingua franca. There are disputes about how to apply this discourse, but the discourse itself is a shared vocabulary. And for that reason, he thinks that any justification that we can provide for human rights will be weaker than the intuition that we have of this right. Right? So any argument, so take something like inflicting severe pain on children for amusement. Any argument that we provide about why it's wrong to inflict severe pain on innocent children will be weaker than our conviction that this is just wrong. And that's the reason that he thinks that we should not feel that intuition is just letting ourselves off easy, that we shouldn't be expecting ourselves to be able to provide an argument, that we should trust our deepest convictions, what he's going to call intuitions. In fact, he would go so far as to say that inflicting severe pain on children or other defenseless individuals is now embedded in what moral wrongness means. Right? That's if we're trying to even articulate, well, what is wrongness? That's the kind of thing we're going to reach for, is something like that. So you're going to turn around the justification in the other direction. But what if something like the right to periodic holidays with pay? Right? That he thinks, it's not clear that we have any deeply embedded intuition about that. So he thinks that human rights talk is adequately justified by our intuitions. It's more certain than the arguments that we can provide, but that only holds for a very limited number of human rights, the most core human rights, the right to life, the right not to be tortured, the right not to be enslaved. And he thinks that often this human rights discourse has indeed proliferated in a problematic way. More and more and more rights being added on that aren't deeply, deeply embedded in our convictions in this way. So I think we're left with the possibility of retrieving something like the early modern nesting of human rights talk in something like natural law discourse. But that is metaphysically ambitious, right? It's not clear how that functions across religious and non-religious lines. It may provide a fuller Christian account for human rights. And then on the other hand, one has something like this intuitionist account of human rights that might provide a way of being very comfortable with a limited number of human rights, but might be a little less comfortable with the proliferation of human rights. So I'm going to leave it there for today, but tomorrow, Thursday, we'll come back to thinking about a specific human right, not to be tortured, which certainly would constitute one of these ones that seems to be in our central core intuitions, but it turns out to also be kind of complex when you delve into whether it's absolute and what it means for it to be an absolute right. Thank you.